The cart man. I've been noticing something peculiar on my morning walks lately, something that probably wouldn't register as important to most people. But somehow, it's become the quiet highlight of my otherwise predictable days. It started about 2 months ago, right when the maple trees began their slow transition from summer green to those first hints of autumn gold. I've always been an early riser, not by choice really, just one of those people whose internal clock refuses to sleep past 5:30, no matter what day it is. So I've made a habit of taking morning walks through our neighborhood, a small pocket of calm just outside the city proper. The air has this special quality at that hour, especially now as summer reluctantly gives way to fall. It's cool but not cold, and there's a stillness that feels almost sacred. Like the world is still half asleep, and I'm being allowed to move through it unnoticed. My route is always the same. Down Maple Street, past the row of 1940s bungalows with their deep porches, then right onto Sycamore Lane where the houses get a little bigger, a little more spaced apart. There's a small park at the end of Sycamore, nothing special, just a swing set, a couple of benches, and a walking path that loops around a modest pond where a few ducks have taken up permanent residence. It was on a Tuesday, I think, when I first noticed him. A tall, lanky man, probably in his 60s, pushing an empty shopping cart along the path that circles the pond. He moved deliberately, unhurried, his posture straight but relaxed. The shopping cart was from the local grocery store about half a mile away, one of those older metal ones with a slight squeak in the front right wheel. I didn't think much of it that first day. Our town has its share of people who collect cans or bottles, though this man didn't look particularly down on his luck. His clothes were clean and well-fitting, khaki pants and a light blue button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to the elbows despite the morning chill. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he wore glasses with thin wire frames that caught the early light when he turned his head. The curious thing was that the cart was completely empty. Not a single can, bottle, or possession of any kind rattled around inside it. Just a clean, empty shopping cart being pushed at a leisurely pace around a neighborhood pond at 6:15 in the morning. The next day, I found myself looking for him without really meaning to. And there he was again, same time, same empty cart, same unhurried pace. He nodded politely as we passed each other, the barest acknowledgement of my existence, and continued on his way. This continued for a week. Each morning, I'd spot him making his slow circuit of the pond, pushing that empty cart with its squeaky wheel. I began to wonder about him, in that idle way you sometimes wonder about strangers whose paths regularly cross your own. What was his story? Why the empty cart? Where did he go afterward? I should mention that I'm not typically the kind of person who gets invested in the habits of strangers. I'm generally content to mind my own business, keep to myself. But there was something about the rhythm of his routine, the dedication to this seemingly pointless task, that stirred my curiosity. By the second week, we had established a wordless ritual of acknowledgement, a nod, sometimes a small wave. Once, he smiled, a brief lifting of the corners of his mouth that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. I began to time my walks so that I would reach the pond just as he was making his circuit. I told myself it was coincidence, but truthfully, I was becoming quietly fascinated. On day 15, yes, I had started counting, I decided to extend my walk to include a loop around the pond. Not to follow him exactly, but to perhaps gain some insight into his routine. As I turned onto the pond path, I noticed for the first time that he wasn't simply going in circles. He would stop at certain points, a bench, a particular tree, a spot where the path came closest to the water, and pause for exactly 30 seconds before moving on. During these pauses, he would stand completely still, hands resting on the handle of the cart, looking straight ahead. Not at anything specific that I could determine, just gazing out at the water or the trees or the empty playground. Then, after his half-minute pause, he would continue until the next stopping point. I counted 6 stopping points around the pond. 6 pauses of 30 seconds each. The entire circuit, with stops, took him precisely 18 minutes. Then he would exit the park the way he had come, pushing his empty cart back up Sycamore Lane until he disappeared from view. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual and positioned myself on a bench with a book I had no intention of reading. I wanted to see where he came from, this man with his empty cart and his precisely timed ritual. At exactly 6:10, he appeared at the park entrance, pushing his cart with that same unhurried purpose. Today his shirt was light green, but otherwise, everything was the same: the khaki pants, the wire-rimmed glasses, the neatly combed silver hair. The cart still squeaked, a rhythmic accompaniment to his measured footsteps on the gravel path. I pretended to read as he began his circuit, but my eyes followed him over the top of my book. He made his first stop at a large oak tree near the park entrance, stood motionless for 30 seconds, then continued. At his second stop, near a cluster of cattails at the pond's edge, something unexpected happened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small paper bag. From it, he took a handful of what looked like bread crumbs and scattered them on the ground near the water. Almost immediately, 3 ducks swam over and began pecking at the offering. The man watched them, his expression unchanged, for exactly 30 seconds. Then he folded the paper bag, returned it to his pocket, and continued on his way. So that was part of it, he fed the ducks. But why the empty shopping cart? And why the precisely timed stops at places where he did nothing but stand and stare? I decided to follow him when he left the park. Not in a creepy way, I told myself. Just out of curiosity. I gave him a head start, then casually strolled after him up Sycamore Lane. He turned right on Elm Street, a road of modest single-story homes with well-kept yards. The morning was quiet, with only the occasional sound of a car starting as early commuters prepared for work. The man kept his steady pace, the cart's squeaky wheel creating a predictable rhythm, squeak, pause, as he walked. For blocks down Elm, he turned into the driveway of a pale yellow house with white trim. The yard was immaculate, with carefully pruned rose bushes lining the front walk. The man pushed his cart up to the garage, pressed a button on the wall, and waited as the door slowly rolled up. Then he pushed the cart inside and disappeared after it. I stood there for a moment, feeling oddly deflated. I'm not sure what I expected, something more unusual perhaps, something that would explain the peculiarity of his morning ritual. But he was just a man who lived in a tidy yellow house, who apparently borrowed shopping carts and took them for walks around the neighborhood pond. The garage door began to lower, and I turned away, continuing my walk with a vague sense of disappointment. The mystery wasn't really solved. If anything, I had more questions now than before. The next morning, I returned to my regular routine, timing my arrival at the pond to coincide with his circuit. We exchanged our usual nod as we passed each other. This time, I noticed a subtle change. There was a small brown paper bag in the cart. Just one, sitting in the center of the otherwise empty basket. For some reason, this minor deviation from the pattern felt significant. I found myself unreasonably curious about what might be in that solitary bag. Was it just more duck food? Or something else? Something that might explain the purpose of these daily journeys with an empty cart. On impulse, I decided to speak to him. Nothing intrusive, just a friendly good morning to break the silence of our daily encounters. As I approached him at his third stopping point, a bench facing the pond, I cleared my throat softly. "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet park. He turned to look at me, his expression mildly surprised but not alarmed. "Good morning," he replied. His voice was deep and measured, with a slight raspiness that suggested it wasn't used often. "Beautiful day," I offered lamely, immediately regretting the banality of the comment. "Yes," he agreed, "it is." And then, unexpectedly, he added, "You walk here often?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Every morning. It's peaceful at this hour." He nodded, his eyes drifting back to the pond where the ducks were beginning to stir. "Peace is valuable," he said simply. We stood in silence for a moment. I was acutely aware that I was interrupting his routine, that his 30-second pause had already extended well beyond its usual duration. "I should let you continue your walk," I said, taking a step back. "Thank you," he replied, and there was genuine gratitude in his voice. Then he added, "Perhaps we'll speak again tomorrow." With that, he resumed pushing his cart, moving on to his fourth stopping point. I remained where I was, watching his tall figure grow smaller as he followed the curve of the path around the pond, the cart's squeaky wheel marking his progress. The next morning, I felt a strange sense of anticipation as I approached the pond. Would he remember our brief conversation? Would he speak to me again? I wasn't sure why it mattered, but somehow it did. He was at his second stopping point when I arrived, standing near the cattails, feeding the ducks. Today there were 4 of them, quacking softly as they gathered around his feet. The brown paper bag was still in his cart, joined now by a small white one. I waited at a respectful distance until he had completed his ritual feeding and began to move again. Then I fell into step beside him, maintaining what I hoped was a companionable silence. When we reached the bench, his third stopping point, he paused as usual. After a moment, he spoke without looking at me. "You're curious about the cart." I felt a flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. "I'm sorry if I've been intrusive." He shook his head slightly. "Curiosity isn't intrusive. It's natural." We were quiet for another moment. The surface of the pond rippled as a light breeze stirred the morning air. "My wife used to love this pond," he said suddenly. "We would walk here together every morning for 32 years. Even in winter, unless the snow was too deep." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I simply nodded. "She had arthritis in her later years," he continued. "Walking became difficult. So I brought the cart for her to lean on." He patted the handle of the shopping cart with a gentle fondness. The grocery store was going to throw it away because of the squeaky wheel. I offered to take it off their hands. "And you still bring it," I said softly, understanding beginning to dawn. "Yes," he replied. "It's been 3 years since she passed. But we still take our walk together every morning." He looked down at the empty cart, and there was such tender devotion in his gaze that I had to look away, feeling like I was intruding on something deeply personal. The stopping points, I asked after a moment. Her favorite spots. Places where she liked to pause and look at the water, or watch the birds, or just close her eyes and feel the breeze. His voice remained steady, matter of fact, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that was almost palpable. And the bags? I nodded toward the cart. For the first time, a small smile appeared on his face. Ah, yes. Would you like to see? I nodded, both curious and touched by his willingness to share. He reached into the cart and picked up the brown paper bag. Opening it carefully, he revealed a collection of smooth, flat stones in various shades of gray and brown. She collected pond stones. Said each one had its own story. I find one each day to add to her collection. Then he picked up the white bag and opened it to show me a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Peanut butter and honey. Her favorite. I have half for breakfast before my walk, and leave half here. He gestured to the bench we were standing near. For the birds, mostly. Though sometimes a squirrel gets lucky. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of his devotion settling around us like a gentle mist. I felt humbled by the simplicity and depth of his ritual, by the quiet way he honored his wife's memory through these daily acts of remembrance. Thank you for telling me, I said finally. I'm sorry if my curiosity was. Well, I just found myself wondering. No need for apologies, he said, his gaze returning to the pond. Sometimes sharing a story makes it more real. He paused, then added, I'm Howard, by the way. James, I replied, offering my hand. His grip was firm and warm. Howard nodded, then glanced at his watch, an old-fashioned timepiece with a worn leather strap. I should continue, he said. I keep to a schedule. Of course, I said, stepping back. It was nice to meet you properly, Howard. He nodded again, then resumed pushing his cart along the path. I watched him go, moving with that same unhurried purpose, the cart's wheel marking his progress with its familiar squeak. The next morning, I deliberately arrived at the pond at my usual time, not wanting to disrupt Howard's routine any more than I already had. He was at his fourth stopping point when I spotted him, standing near a flowering dogwood tree that was just beginning to show hints of fall color. As I walked past, he acknowledged me with a slight nod, but made no move to speak. I returned the nod and continued on my way, respecting the private nature of his morning ritual. For the next week, we returned to our previous pattern of silent acknowledgement. Sometimes I would arrive as he was leaving, sometimes our paths would cross at various points around the pond, but we exchanged nothing more than nods or brief waves. I was content with this arrangement, feeling privileged to understand the meaning behind his daily journeys with the empty cart. Then one morning, as I was approaching the park, I saw Howard standing at the entrance, seemingly waiting for something. As I drew closer, I realized he was waiting for me. Good morning, James, he said, his voice carrying that same measured calmness. Good morning, Howard, I replied, surprised by this deviation from our established routine. I thought perhaps you might like to join me today, he said, gesturing toward the path that circled the pond. If you're not in a hurry. I was touched by the invitation. I'd like that very much, I said. He nodded, satisfied, and began pushing his cart along the familiar route. I fell into step beside him, matching his unhurried pace. The morning was particularly beautiful, with a thin mist hovering just above the pond's surface, catching the early light in a way that turned everything slightly golden. We walked in companionable silence until we reached his first stopping point at the oak tree. Howard paused, as was his custom, and stood quietly for his usual 30 seconds. I waited beside him, letting my gaze wander over the pond and the trees beyond. She planted this tree, Howard said suddenly, breaking the silence. For our 10th anniversary. The park was allowing residents to donate trees at the time. He reached out and placed his palm against the rough bark. 35 years old now. Still young for an oak. I looked at the tree with new appreciation, noticing its healthy girth and the way its branches spread to create a perfect canopy. It's beautiful, I said. A living anniversary gift. Howard nodded, then resumed pushing his cart. We continued to his second stopping point near the cattails, where he performed his ritual feeding of the ducks. Today there were 5 of them, familiar enough with Howard that they waddled up as soon as they saw him approaching. They recognize you, I observed as the ducks quacked appreciatively around his feet. Creatures of habit, like me, Howard replied with the ghost of a smile. Margaret named them all, even though they probably weren't the same ducks from year to year. He nodded toward a particularly bold duck with distinctive white markings on its head. That one she would have called Herbert. She had a great-uncle Herbert who was equally demanding at meal times. I laughed softly at this, and Howard's smile became a little more pronounced. We continued our circuit of the pond, stopping at each of Howard's designated spots. At each one, he shared a small story or memory about Margaret, how she loved the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves of the dogwood tree at his 4th stopping point, or how she would close her eyes and listen to the wind in the reeds at the 5th. At the 6th and final stopping point, a simple wooden bench facing the sunrise, Howard reached into his cart and removed the white paper bag containing his half of the peanut butter and honey sandwich. With careful precision, he unwrapped it and broke it into small pieces, which he placed on the bench beside him. "Would you like to do the honors today?" he asked, holding out a piece of the sandwich. I was unexpectedly moved by this simple offer. "I'd be happy to," I said, accepting the piece of sandwich and placing it on the bench. We watched in silence as a bold chickadee swooped down to investigate our offering, quickly followed by a pair of sparrows. Soon the bench was hosting a small avian breakfast party, birds darting in to grab pieces of sandwich and then retreating to nearby branches to enjoy their meal. Margaret loved birds, Howard said, his voice soft with remembrance. We had feeders all over our yard. She knew all their songs, could identify them just by the sound. As we stood watching the birds, I found myself thinking about the nature of grief and remembrance, about the different ways people find to honor those they've lost. Howard's daily ritual with his empty shopping cart, which had seemed so peculiar to me initially, now struck me as one of the most beautiful expressions of continued love I had ever encountered. When the birds had consumed every crumb of the sandwich, Howard checked his watch. "That concludes our morning circuit," he said, his tone carrying a gentle formality. "Thank you for joining me, James." "Thank you for the invitation," I replied sincerely. "It was a privilege." Howard nodded and then began pushing his cart toward the park exit. I walked alongside him until we reached the street, where our paths would diverge. "Perhaps you would join me again sometime," Howard said, not quite a question but not quite a statement either. "I'd like that," I said. "Whenever you feel like company." Howard nodded again, seemingly satisfied, and began his journey home, the cart's squeaky wheel marking his progress up Sycamore Lane. As I turned to continue my own walk, I realized that my perception had been fundamentally shifted. What had once seemed like an old man's peculiar habit now appeared as a profound daily act of devotion. The empty cart wasn't empty at all. It was filled with memory, with love, with the presence of someone who was physically gone but still very much present in the heart and mind of the one who remained. In the days that followed, I often saw Howard during my morning walks, though I didn't always join him for his full circuit. Sometimes we would walk together for a portion of his route, sometimes we would simply exchange greetings as our paths crossed. Occasionally, when I sensed that he wanted solitude, would give him a respectful nod from a distance and continue on my way. One particularly crisp morning in early October, when the leaves were beginning to turn in earnest and the air held the first real promise of fall, I arrived at the pond to find Howard at his usual feeding spot with the ducks. But today, something was different. There was a woman with him, probably in her 30s, with Howard's same tall frame and a familiar set to her shoulders. I hesitated, not wanting to intrude, but Howard spotted me and raised his hand in greeting. Taking this as an invitation, I approached. "James," Howard said, "this is my daughter, Emily." "Emily, this is James, who walks in the mornings like we do." Emily extended her hand with a warm smile. "Dad's mentioned you. It's nice to put a face to the name." "Likewise," I said, shaking her hand. "Your father has been kind enough to share his morning ritual with me occasionally." Emily's smile softened. "Mom's walk," she said simply, glancing at the cart with its squeaky wheel. Howard nodded, his expression serene. "Emily joins me when she visits. About once a month." "I live about an hour away," Emily explained. "Not too far, but with work and the kids, I don't get over as often as I'd like." We stood chatting for a few minutes, the ducks milling impatiently around our feet, clearly wondering why their breakfast was being delayed by all this human conversation. "We should continue," Howard said finally, reaching for the paper bag in his cart. "The ducks are getting restless. And Dad never varies his schedule," Emily added with affectionate understanding. "I'll see you at the next stop, James. Dad's told me you sometimes walk the circuit with him." "Only when invited," I assured her. Emily's smile widened. The fact that he invited you at all says a lot. My father isn't exactly known for seeking out new friendships. Howard made a small harumphing sound as he scattered bread for the ducks. I'm perfectly sociable when there's a reason to be. Emily and I exchanged amused glances, and I felt a surge of warmth for this man who had so unexpectedly become a part of my daily life. I joined them for the remainder of Howard's circuit that day, listening as father and daughter shared memories of Margaret at each stopping point. Emily had brought fresh flowers, bright yellow dahlias, which she placed on the bench at the final stop, arranging them carefully next to the pieces of sandwich that Howard set out for the birds. Mom loved dahlias, she explained to me. Said they were the most cheerful flowers in the garden. As we completed the circuit and prepared to go our separate ways, Emily turned to me with a serious expression. Thank you, she said quietly, for being my dad's walking companion sometimes. It means a lot to know he has someone to talk to out here. It's my pleasure, I assured her. Your father has. Well, he's changed the way I see things. Emily nodded in understanding. He has that effect, she said. Once you get past the quiet exterior. We said our goodbyes, and I continued on my regular route, thinking about Howard and Emily and the ways we create meaning in the face of loss. Over the next few weeks, as autumn settled in fully and the mornings grew colder, Howard and I established a comfortable routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I would join him for his full circuit of the pond. On other days, we might walk together briefly or simply exchange greetings as we passed each other. I learned more about Margaret with each walk, how she had been a botany professor at the local community college, how she could name every plant and tree in the park, how she had met Howard at a bird-watching event when they were both in their 20s. Through Howard's stories, shared in his measured, thoughtful way, I began to feel as if I knew her too. And I shared things about myself as well, my work as a technical writer, my recent divorce, my struggle to find purpose now that my children were grown and building lives of their own. Howard listened with the same attentive silence he gave to the birds and the trees and the changing seasons, offering occasional insights that were all the more valuable for their rarity. Transitions, he said one morning after I had been lamenting my empty nest, are not endings. They're doorways. Sometimes we stand in the doorway a long while before we see what's on the other side. It was the kind of simple wisdom that Howard seemed to specialize in, straightforward but profound, practical but somehow poetic. As October waned and November approached, bringing colder mornings and the last brilliant flare of autumn colors, I noticed that Howard seemed a little slower, a little more careful in his movements. His posture was still straight, his routine unchanged, but there was a subtle hesitation sometimes as he navigated the uneven parts of the path. One morning, as we stood at the oak tree that Margaret had planted, Howard leaned against the cart a little more heavily than usual. Are you feeling all right? I asked, trying not to sound overly concerned. Howard nodded. Just the usual complaints of age, he said. Nothing serious. But I noticed that he kept one hand on the cart at all times now, using it for support in a way that hadn't been necessary before. The cart, which had begun as Margaret's walking aid and become a vessel for Howard's memories, was now serving its original purpose again. The irony wasn't lost on Howard. "Full circle," he commented with a small smile when I mentioned it. "The cart supports me now, as it once supported her." Despite his assurances, I found myself watching Howard more closely in the days that followed, noting the slight stiffness in his movements, the careful way he navigated steps and curbs. He never complained, never missed a day of his ritual circuit around the pond, but it was clear that the effort was becoming greater. I called Emily one evening, having gotten her number from Howard, in case of emergency, though he had made it clear that he didn't consider his own increasing frailty to be any kind of emergency. "He's definitely slowing down," Emily agreed when I shared my observations. "But you know Dad, stubborn as they come. He insists he's fine on his own, doesn't need help, doesn't want to be a burden." She sighed. "I've been trying to convince him to consider assisted living, or at least to let me hire someone to check in on him regularly, but he won't hear of it." "The walks are important to him," I said, feeling oddly protective of Howard's independence. "I know," Emily replied. "And I don't want to take that away from him. But I worry about him out there alone if he were to fall, or I don't know. I just worry." After our conversation, I began to make a point of being at the pond every morning, not just on our designated walking days. I would adjust my route so that I would cross paths with Howard at least once during his circuit, just to assure myself that he was managing. He knew what I was doing, of course. Howard missed very little, but he accepted my presence with his usual dignified grace. One particularly cold morning in late November, when the first dusting of snow had left the ground crisp and white, I spotted Howard at his usual time, pushing his cart with determined slowness along the path. I was about to call out a greeting when I saw him pause, one hand going to his chest. I hurried toward him, alarmed. "Howard, are you all right?" He looked up at my approach, his expression strained but composed. "Just a little short of breath," he said. "Give me a moment." I stood beside him, ready to offer support if needed, as he took several deep breaths. After a minute or so, his color improved, and he straightened up. "Better?" I asked. "Much," he replied, though I noticed his hand remained on the cart handle with a tighter grip than usual. "Maybe we should cut the walk short today," I suggested carefully. "The path is a bit slippery with the snow." Howard considered this for a moment, then nodded, a concession that worried me more than his momentary discomfort had. Howard never varied his routine. "Perhaps just to the bench and back," he agreed. We moved slowly along the path, Howard keeping a firm grip on the cart, me staying close to his side. When we reached the bench, the final stopping point in his usual circuit, Howard sank down onto it with evident relief. "I think," he said after catching his breath, "that I might need to see my doctor." Coming from Howard, this was the equivalent of another man declaring a medical emergency. I immediately pulled out my phone. "Would you like me to call now? Or I could drive you to the clinic." Howard shook his head. "Not this moment. I have an appointment next week. I'll ask Emily to move it up." I nodded, relieved that he was taking his condition seriously. "In the meantime, maybe I could drive you home. It's getting colder, and the path won't get any less slippery." Howard looked out over the pond, where a thin skin of ice was forming around the edges. The ducks had gathered in the center where the water was still open, huddled together for warmth. "Yes," he said finally. "I think that would be wise." It was the first time in all the months I had known him that Howard had left the park without completing his full ritual circuit. I could see what this deviation cost him in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his mouth. But he allowed me to help him to my car, the shopping cart squeaking along beside us. We loaded the cart into my trunk. It just barely fit with the back seats folded down, and I drove Howard the short distance to his tidy yellow house on Elm Street. As I helped him up the front walk, Howard paused to look back at the cart jutting from my open trunk. "Margaret would find this quite amusing," he said. "Me being escorted home like a wayward child." "I think she'd be pleased that you're being sensible," I replied, supporting his elbow as we navigated the 3 shallow steps to his front porch. Howard's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Perhaps," he conceded. Though she always claimed sensible was never my strong suit. Inside, Howard's house was exactly as I might have imagined it, neat, comfortable, and filled with books. Photos of Margaret were everywhere, on the mantel, the bookshelves, the piano in the corner. She had been a handsome woman with a direct gaze and what appeared to be a ready smile. In most of the photos, she and Howard were outdoors, hiking, bird-watching, standing beside the ocean. Howard settled into a worn leather armchair by the window, waving me toward the matching one across from it. "Tea?" he offered. "Or coffee, if you prefer." "Let me make it," I said, already moving toward what I assumed was the kitchen. "You rest." Howard didn't argue, which I took as another sign that he wasn't feeling well. I found the kitchen easily enough. The house had a simple, logical layout, and put the kettle on to boil. While I waited, I glanced around the tidy space. Like the rest of the house, it was neat but lived in, with a bird feeder visible through the window above the sink. A magnetic notepad on the refrigerator held a shopping list in Howard's precise handwriting: bread, eggs, apples, bird seed. When the tea was ready, I brought 2 mugs back to the living room, setting Howard's on the small table beside his chair. "The cart man, part 2 of 2. Thank you," he said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "I don't entertain much these days. It's nice to have company." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our tea and watching the snow begin to fall more heavily outside the window. Eventually, Howard spoke. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful, "about what Emily said regarding assisted living." I tried to keep my expression neutral. "Oh." Howard nodded slowly. "I've always valued my independence. And this house. It holds so much of Margaret. The thought of leaving it." He trailed off, his gaze moving to a photograph on the side table, Margaret in a wide-brimmed hat, laughing at something beyond the camera's view. "But," I prompted gently. "But practicality must sometimes take precedence over sentiment," he continued. "My heart isn't what it used to be. The doctor has been monitoring a condition for some time now. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but—" He shrugged slightly. "The body has its own timeline." I wasn't sure how to respond. Howard wasn't the type of man who invited sympathy or platitudes. "I've lived a good life," he said, seeming to read my thoughts. 67 years with Margaret, if you count from the day we met. That's more than most people get." "It's a remarkable partnership," I agreed, noting his use of the present tense when speaking of their marriage. Howard's gaze returned to the window, where the snow was coming down in earnest now, transforming the world into a soft white landscape. "The difficulty," he said after a moment, "is the cart." I waited, knowing there was more. "The assisted living facility Emily has found. It's quite nice, actually. Near her home, good medical care on site, private apartments. But there's no place for the cart. No pond to walk around." I understood then the real sacrifice Howard was contemplating, not just leaving his home, but potentially giving up his daily ritual, his way of keeping Margaret present in his life. "Perhaps," I suggested carefully, "there might be a way to adapt the ritual. The facility must have grounds or gardens where you could walk." Howard nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, Emily mentioned there are walking paths. But the cart—" He sighed. "It would be seen as peculiar, I think. And explanations can be tiresome." We sat in silence again, considering the problem. Outside, The snow continued to fall, erasing the edges of things, creating a world of soft contours and quiet beauty.